The world still pictures Britain a certain way, steady, ceremonial. The country that gave democracy its grammar, that held together through blitz and bankruptcy and empire's long unravelling. The mother of parliaments, they called Westminster. The gold standard of political stability. That reputation was built over centuries. It has been spent in under a decade. On Monday, the 22nd of June, Keir Starmer walked to a podium outside number 10 Downing Street and announced he was resigning. He becomes the 6th British Prime Minister to leave office in 10 years. 6. Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, Starmer. A country that once exported its constitutional model to the world is now burning through leaders faster than most democracies hold elections. The memes write themselves, the consequences do not. Because this is not a comedy. It is a compounding economic crisis wearing a political costume. Every time a Prime Minister falls, business investment pauses. Every time the markets watch another resignation speech, they quietly reprice British risk. Every time the country resets, the structural problems that broke the last government are patiently waiting for the next one. Britain does not have a leadership problem. It has a system problem. And no single leader, no matter how competent or how well-intentioned, can fix a broken system simply by occupying it. Today, the question is not who comes next. Today, the question is why nobody lasts. And if you think the answer is simply bad luck or bad leaders, stay with me, because the real answer is far darker than that. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. 6 prime ministers in 10 years is not a streak of bad luck. It is a statistical signal. For context, Japan, a country long mocked for its own leadership instability, averaged 1 prime minister roughly every year for 2 decades before stabilising. The UK is now approaching that tempo, and unlike Japan, Britain is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, the 5th or 6th largest economy on Earth, and a country whose political decisions send signals into global bond markets. The revolving door began with Brexit. David Cameron called the 2016 referendum confident he would win it, and lost. His departure triggered a succession crisis that has never really ended. Theresa May took the poisoned chalice and spent 3 years failing to deliver the impossible mandate she inherited. Boris Johnson won a landslide in 2019 on the back of charisma and a 3-word slogan, then collapsed under the weight of his own scandals. Liz Truss lasted 45 days. 45 days. A head of lettuce outlasted her, and that joke went viral in every language because it captured something true. The British state had become ungovernable by anyone with radical intentions. Rishi Sunak tried managerial competence. The electorate threw him out with one of the largest parliamentary defeats in Conservative history. Keir Starmer won a landslide in 2024 and was gone by June 2026, devoured not by voters but by his own MPs. The party that killed the Tories for 14 years of chaos ran through the same script in 23 months. These are not coincidences, they are symptoms. The promise was simple. Take back control, sovereignty, borders, money. Give it back to the British people. That was the mandate delivered by 52% of the electorate in 2016, the single largest democratic vote in UK history. It was also, as every Prime Minister who followed Cameron discovered, entirely undeliverable without catastrophic cost to the economy, a breakdown of the union with Scotland, and the reopening of the Irish border question. So nobody delivered it. They diluted it, deferred it, and decorated it. They called it Brexit in name, and gave the country something closer to Brexit in paperwork. The result was the worst of all worlds, the economic damage of leaving the single market without the political clarity of a clean break, the disruption to trade without the regulatory freedom that was supposed to compensate for it. A generation of business leaders who planned for one outcome and received a decade of ambiguity instead. The OBR in 2025 estimated UK productivity growth at just 0.4% annually since 2020, the weakest in the G7. That is not a coincidence. It is the compounding drag of an unresolved constitutional crisis expressed in GDP figures. Meanwhile, the politicians who made the promises moved on. The voters who believed them are still waiting. And that broken promise, never formally admitted, never properly confronted, sits underneath every subsequent political crisis like a fault line. If you're watching this and you recognise this pattern in other countries, drop it in the comments. This matters more than most people realise. If you want to understand how this story ends, subscribe now and hit the bell. Here is something almost nobody says out loud in British political discourse. It does not matter very much which party wins. The Treasury wins, the civil service wins, the institutional consensus wins. This is not conspiracy theory. It is bureaucratic physics. The UK Treasury operates on a doctrine that has remained broadly consistent across Conservative and Labour governments for 30 years. Taxes must rise to protect spending commitments. Growth will be managed at around 1 to 2% annually, and structural reform will be deferred until the fiscal math improves. The fiscal math never improves. By 2029, UK tax revenues are projected to reach 38% of GDP, a historic high. That number crosses party lines. The Conservatives raised the tax burden significantly before 2024. Labour's 2024 budget pushed it higher still, with employer national insurance contributions rising and income tax thresholds frozen until 2031. The OBR calculates that the freeze alone will push an additional 4.8 million people into the higher rate of tax as wages rise. Ordinary working families are dragged into a higher bracket not by prosperity, but by fiscal inertia. Meanwhile, the OBR's March 2026 outlook projects GDP growth of just 1.1% in 2026, falling from already tepid levels. High taxes and low growth are not an accident. It is the settled operating assumption of a treasury that has never been fundamentally challenged. Every prime minister inherits it. Most of them eventually become its servants. The Conservative Party spent a century as the natural party of British government. Low taxes, strong institutions, individual responsibility, and borders that worked. That was the brand. That was the covenant with its voters. Then something happened. Over the course of 3 decades, the party drifted. It absorbed the managerial assumptions of New Labour after 1997. It embraced austerity without the structural reform that should have accompanied it. It kept spending commitments that required a tax burden Conservatives were supposed to oppose. And most importantly, it failed to deliver the thing its own voters had explicitly voted for: control of immigration. This is not a minor policy disagreement. It is an existential credibility collapse. The Conservative Party promised to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands. For years, the official figure stayed well above 200,000 annually, peaking at an ONS revised 944,000 net arrivals in the year to March 2023. Those are not Conservative numbers. Those are numbers that represent a complete failure of political will by a party claiming to be hawkish on borders. By the time the Conservatives lost power in 2024, their core voters had simply stopped believing them. Not disliked them. Stopped believing them. There is a difference, and it is fatal. You can recover from being disliked. You cannot easily recover from being considered a fiction. The party that was supposed to be the custodian of stability had become the source of the instability. And the voters noticed. Every party that has governed Britain since 2010 has promised to reduce immigration. Every party failed. This is not because British politicians are uniquely dishonest, though some are. It is because the promise was made without confronting the underlying economics. The NHS needs foreign nurses. The care sector needs foreign care workers. Universities depend on international student fees. Agriculture depends on seasonal labour. The economy in its current configuration needs the immigration that the politicians were promising to stop. The peak was ugly. The ONS revised net migration figures show 944,000 net arrivals in the year to March 2023, a number that exceeds the population of Birmingham. That figure has since come down sharply, falling to around 204,000 in the year to June 2025, driven largely by visa restrictions on student dependents and care workers introduced from 2024. But here is the catch the headlines missed. Even as numbers fell, the composition shifted. Asylum claims hit record levels in 2025, with the UK ranking 5th in Europe in absolute numbers and 15th per capita. The small boats kept coming, and crucially the British nationals leaving accelerated. around 110,000 Brits aged 16 to 34 emigrated in the year to June 2025, 3/4 of all British national emigration. Young, educated, economically productive people are quietly leaving the country in rising numbers. Britain is not just struggling to manage who comes in, it is struggling to keep the people it needs from walking out. Politicians come and go, as we have established, with remarkable frequency. But the civil service is permanent, and there is a body of evidence drawn from ministerial memoirs, parliamentary inquiries, and the testimony of advisers across party lines that suggests the British civil service does not simply implement government policy. It shapes it, filters it, and in some cases quietly buries it. This is what critics have taken to calling the blob, an interconnected network of senior officials, Quango executives, and institutional stakeholders who share a broadly similar worldview about what is politically possible, what is legally permissible, and what the Treasury will allow. That worldview tends to be risk-averse, incremental, and protective of existing spending commitments. Reform, in any meaningful sense, sits outside it. Dominic Cummings built a career on trying to break through this layer and failed. Kwasi Kwarteng tried to move faster than institutional guardrails permitted and triggered a bond market crisis. Priti Patel spent years fighting her own Home Office over immigration enforcement and produced minimal results. This is not ancient history. It is the operating reality of the British government as of 2026. Any incoming Prime Minister, whether it is Andy Burnham or Nigel Farage or anyone else, will face the same institutional inertia the moment they walk through the door of number 10. The energy of the campaign meets the gravity of the system. The system, so far, has always won. There is a moment in every democratic crisis when the public stops being disappointed and starts being something more dangerous, disengaged from the institutions themselves. Britain reached that point somewhere between Partygate and the Liz Truss mini-budget. Partygate was not simply a scandal about parties, it was a revelation about how the people in charge actually viewed the rules they were making. The Truss budget was not simply bad economics. It was proof that the people in charge could crash the pound on a Tuesday afternoon and be gone by October. Together, they created something that polling data has struggled to fully capture: a collapse of the premise that the political class is operating in good faith. By November 2025, Keir Starmer's net approval rating had fallen to negative 46%, making him the least popular Prime Minister in Ipsos polling records going back to 1977. That is a record he holds. Not Boris Johnson, not Liz Truss. Starmer, the man elected in 2024 to restore trust. The public did not simply dislike his policies, they concluded he was not capable of delivering change within the current system. And by May 2026, when Labour lost over 1,500 council seats in local elections, and Reform gained more than 600, the verdict was written in seat counts. The British working and middle classes did not go back to the Conservatives, they went somewhere else entirely. That somewhere else has a name. Reform UK did not exist in its current form before 2021. By the start of 2026, it was polling above 30% nationally, and being described as the most popular political force in the country by several independent measures. One MRP poll projected Reform winning 445 seats in a general election, the largest majority in modern British political history, with Labour reduced to 73 seats and the Conservatives to 7. 7 seats for a party that has governed Britain for most of the last century. That projection may or may not materialise. But the scale of the shift it represents is real regardless. What Reform weaponised is simple to understand and hard to counter. It took the gap between what the two legacy parties promised and what they delivered on immigration, on economic growth, on the cost of living, on borders, and turned that gap into a political weapon. Farage's local election results in May 2026 gave Reform control of councils in areas Labour had held for generations. Essex, traditionally a Conservative heartland, went to Reform. Labour's northern strongholds cracked. The Conservatives were wiped out in their own territories, and this happened while Reform itself is being challenged from the right, with former Reform MP Rupert Lowe's New Restore Britain party fracturing the insurgent vote. British politics is not consolidating, it is shattering. The two-party system that structured British democracy for a century is gone. What comes next has not yet been named. So the question this video started with remains unanswered. Who will save the UK? Andy Burnham will walk into Downing Street, likely by September 2026, carrying the same impossible inheritance every predecessor carried. Sluggish growth projected at 1.1% for 2026 by the OBR. A tax burden heading toward 38% of GDP. Public debt is approaching 95% of GDP. An NHS under structural pressure that no spending commitment has meaningfully relieved. A reform insurgency that gained 600 council seats on the day he needed to start building a mandate, and a public that, after 6 prime ministers in 10 years, has run out of benefit of the doubt. The structural choice facing the UK is not really left versus right. It is not Labour versus Conservative or establishment versus insurgent. It is simpler and more frightening than any of those framings. The choice is between a system that reforms itself before the crisis forces it to, or a system that waits until the crisis forces it to. Britain has been choosing the second option, quietly and consistently, for at least 15 years. The can has been kicked so far down the road that the road itself is now in question. The person who can fix this does not simply need political skill. They need the ability to stare down the Treasury, the civil service, the media, their own party and the markets simultaneously, while governing a country that no longer trusts the people who govern it. That person has not appeared yet. The revolving door is still turning, and the costs of this moment are not being paid by the politicians. They are being paid by the people watching from outside the door.